because it's Yom Kippur, I want to use this opportunity to travel back in time for a moment. Let me take you to the land of Israel, to the year 200 before the Common Era. With the decline of Jerusalem as our administrative center, also the central role of the great priest is declining. These circumstances and emerging needs give rise to a new kind of leadership, the pairs, couples. In fact, this chapter in our history is called the period of the pairs, Tkufat HaZugot. These leadership Zugot were conformed by the president of the Sanhedrin, which in today's terms would be a combination between prime minister and chief rabbi. And the other role was Av Beit Adin, the head of the rabbinical court, the chief justice. It's holiday time. The people have gathered in the Temple Mount, and the sacrificial offering is about to be made. Then they realize it. It is a mitzvah to place your hands on the head of the offering. And at the same time, you are not supposed to touch an animal on a holiday. So they turn toward the authorities. In the Mishnah that I will read to you now, the first ones are presidents, and the second are chiefs of the court. Each zug belongs to a different generation. Yosei ben Yoser said that the hands may not be placed. Yosef ben Yochanan said that they may. Joshua ben Prachia said that they may not. Nitai, the Arvelite, said that they may. Then Judah ben Tabai said that they may not. Shimon ben Shatach said that they may. And finally, Hillel and Menachem did not dispute. And so, Menachem went out, and Shammai entered. Shammai said that they may not. Hillel say that they may. You might think this is a Talmudic discussion, meaning a complicated, abstract idea that is just trying to help us gain some brain muscle. But for the rabbis, this wasn't abstract at all. The final stroke for the destruction of the temple was in the year 70 of the Common Era, only a generation after the end of the time of the Zugot. Later on, the rabbis explain that Jerusalem was destroyed due to sinat chinam, mindless, unjustified hatred between siblings. Jerusalem was destroyed as a result of a process of moral decline. So what is this story illustrating to us? The rabbis saw it coming. They identified the social inability to deal with diverse opinions and perspectives. They saw the tendency to villainize, objectify, and dehumanize the other side. And so they tried to offer an alternative model, a model that could contain elu ve'elu, this and that, a model for which containing different phases of truth was not only an aspiration, but rather an imperative. That's why Menachem had to go. In this model, disputes are called machlokot leshem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven. This is per se the Talmudic model. The premise for this idea is that sustainable societies live and thrive in dialogue and in diversity, as opposed to in monologues and in uniformity. Now that you heard the words dialogue, diversity, and hatred, you know that we are not time traveling anymore. And we are right here in the 2022 United States of America. In his article, Our Technology Sickness and How to Heal It, Israeli thinker Micha Goodman explains, quote, 20 years ago, political identity did not demarcate our intellectual or social horizons. Today, however, in contrast to the Talmudic ideal of nurturing an intellectual world wider than one's practice, our intellectual world has shrunk to fit the narrower dimensions of policy and practice. The books we read, the lectures we hear, and the videos we watch are all produced by people in our own camp. In short, we have sunk into an anti-Talmudic world. End quote. To stretch his argument, Goodman brings up two studies. The first study shows that the percentage of those who would be bothered by their child marrying someone affiliated with a different political party went from 10% in the 1950s to over 50% in 2010. In the second study that he presents, people were asked to rate their level of sympathy toward people from other side of the political map. On the scale of 0 for hatred, 100 for love, in 1995, the average score was 40. Republicans did not particularly like Democrats, and Democrats did not particularly like Republicans. However, 20 years later, the score dropped significantly, from 40 to 7. Within 20 years, says Goodman, Americans began to hate those who hold opposing political views. And he concludes, intellectual horizons are narrowing to fit political positions. And then I remembered it's actually all about Amalek, he told me. 15 years ago, I was having a conversation with then PhD candidate, today doctor and professor, Asaf Turgeman of Haifa University, who shared with me a brilliant concept. Amalek is our biblical arch enemy. It is the one who attacked us at the moment of most vulnerability and from behind our backs. And so Torah specifically commands us to blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Dr. Turgeman explains that there is a tendency in the Jewish tradition to treat Amalek not only as a people, but also, and mainly, as a symbol. Rather than the limited biblical definition of Amalek, Amalek was made by us the representation of all hatred to Jews. To support his point, he quotes Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who said, "All haters of Israel are of the seed of Amalek." But there's a huge problem with that. When in our current disputes we see the other side as some mutation of Amalek, we are no longer dealing with a one-off event. We are no longer dealing with the present. Then what we are facing is a mountain of hatred that has piled over 2,000 years of history. The tragedy is that that mountain prevents us from dealing with the reality of now. And maybe, to some extent, that is what's happening to the American society. In our polarization, we no longer recognize different views. We identify threats. We see on the other side the representation of all what's wrong and scares us. We are seeing Amalek everywhere. And that's called fundamental attribution error. Explains Professor Jonathan Haidt, author of The Righteous Mind, that our righteous minds were designed to unite us into teams, divide us against other teams, and blind us to the truth. Now, this is what this idea looks like through the lens of attribution bias. For our group, intentions count, and we can forgive wrongdoings. For the other group, only their actions count. For our group, circumstances can explain mistakes. For the other group, mistakes are not circumstantial and are explained only by their poor character traits. For our group, our political aspirations represent care and fairness. For the other group, they represent their lack of perspective and selfishness. In fact, their views are dangerous, and they are a threat to our existence. And so, we can't engage in civic disagreement over specific views because we see each other as Amalek, as the representation of ultimate evil, which is a threat and needs to be blotted out. In her very pointing resignation letter to the New York Times, journalist Betty Weiss wrote, "Truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few whose job is to inform everyone else. Now history itself is one more ephemeral thing molded to fit the needs of a predetermined narrative." Back to Haidt. He explains that we are trapped in a moral matrix. Matrix as the movie, he refers. He really means that. And the only way to break through it is by working to recognize the truth of moral diversity and by cultivating moral humility. Our tradition teaches, make yourself a heart of many rooms and bring into it the words of the house of Shammai and the words of the house of Hillel. this can only happen when we engage with those that think differently. As opposed to running away, seeking shelter in some safe space and hoping that they, the other side, will eventually come to reason or vanish, whatever comes first. Now, there are situations in which one can no longer interact, and unfortunately, we should seek distance and shelter, and that should always be a possibility. On the other hand, when this becomes the norm of our social behavior, then we eliminate any chance for interchange and moral diversity. I remember a couple of years ago, as we were heading toward the presidential elections, I participated in an effort to encourage people to reach across partisan lines. We would say, speak with friends and neighbors that hold different views and try to learn about their values. And an answer I heard many times from people I know are highly educated and driven by good intentions was, seeing what's happening, how can you assume that the other side holds any values? Dear friends, the last couple of years reminded us that there is no immunity for certain viruses. Cynicism is one of them. And it is extremely poisonous and contagious. So how can we heal from our own cynicism, challenge our own narrowness, and yes, our attribution bias? How can we create a heart of many rooms? It is a well-known idea in the work for peace and in general for reconciliation that groundbreaking progress is achieved when the sides recognize the reality of different narratives, believing that there could be legitimacy or even some merit to a different approach doesn't diminish our narrative. Truth, most of the time, doesn't belong in dichotomies. It is not yours or mine. Truth often looks like a Talmudic dialogue in which there are different sides, not for the sake of brain muscle, but rather for the sake of social strength. There is another rabbinical concept that teaches us to lishpot lekaf zchut. This is often translated as to give people the benefit of the doubt. However, that's not the literal translation. The literal translation is to judge people favorably. Assume that the other side are people exactly as you are, and that they also mostly, as you do, as we do, have good intentions. Now, if there is anything to doubt, it's our blink judgments, those judgments that are made quickly based only on our own narrative and disconnected from circumstances. Those judgments in which the other becomes the personification of all what's painful and wrong in our world. If we are experiencing outrage for the wrongs we recognize in our society, and there are many, then we too should invest in planting the seeds for an alternative model. Remember the rabbis? The rabbis saw it coming. They saw the tendency to villainize, objectify, and dehumanize the other side. And so they put themselves in the situation of building upon disagreements. Not because it was comfortable. The reality is that our world is becoming narrower and that we cannot fix anyone else's narrowness. And so, our hope for expansion can only materialize if we start by ourselves. Maybe that shift in our hearts will create a space for the many rooms, for a society that in its ability to engage in dialogue and recognize and honor the dignity of the difference becomes not only a safer, but a better one. It can only start from our own hearts. As we say, Be'ashevota el levabecha. I wish you Chatima Tova, and yes, a Talmudic year for all of us. Shana Tova. We'll continue our